All right, welcome back. And this is our last video for the Rathus Introductory Psych Text. This is chapter 14, Social Psychology. In the previous video, we spent a lot of time, I say a lot of time, we spent most of our time sort of looking at the relationship between attitudes and behaviors. There is a relationship, a connection between these two concepts, but it is somewhat weak or moderate depending on the context. There's a lot of contextual factors that are important. So you can go back and watch that video again if you'd like to revisit this. But for now, we're going to move forward and through chapter 14. We're going to look at the importance of social perception, basically why, looking at, the impressions that we make upon others, and specifically we talk about first impressions, also known as primacy effect. It's the things, the judgments or evaluations that people will make when they first, meet you or when you first meet somebody. Those matter a lot. Those really stick with us. Those first impressions are what really stand out to us, and also recency effect, the same thing, our most recent impressions. And this kind of goes back to memory, which we talked about in chapter 6. Like, remember the primacy and recency effect, that we tend to remember things at the beginning and the end of a list rather than the middle. And the same thing when we think about, other people or the impressions that we have of other people, is that, the things that are most salient, the things that stand out to us tend to be what has happened most recently, or maybe our most recent interaction, and then first impressions. And so, you can think about if those things go wrong. Let's say maybe you meet somebody, maybe you're on a date, and your first date with somebody and it goes wrong, you can see how that lasting memory of that first bad date could potentially spoil the development of a relationship, even though maybe if you had just hung out a few more times, things would have been great. But that one event, maybe that's really sticks out in people's mind. Or the most recent experience, maybe you've been on a date with somebody a few times and maybe, all the previous dates were great, but this most recent one, it didn't go so great. And now, you're not sure where to go. Those things matter. What's kind of most recently on our mind, and maybe first impressions are what really stick out to us, good or bad, for better or worse. And based on these experiences, we make attributions about other people. We try to make attributions that explain why people behave the way they do. We also try to make attributions about ourselves, and other people are also conversely making attributions about us and themselves as well. So this is where we're kind of going next, is looking at attributions or beliefs that we make about. And attributions are just another way of saying attitudes. And there's this whole branch of social psychology that it looks at attributions, the judgments and beliefs we make about other people, and how those relate to our own behavior and the behavior of other people. How do we explain other people's behaviors? In one case, we can make attributions based on dispositions, which are internal factors like who this person is fundamentally, or we can make attributions based on situational factors, contextual factors. The person's behavior is related to the situation, not necessarily who they are fundamentally. And this is really important. So typically, when we're trying to explain the behavior of other people's behaviors, we tend to succumb, more often than not, we succumb to what's known as the fundamental attribution error, where we tend to explain other people's behaviors based on their disposition rather than the context. So, for example, if you were driving to work one day and somebody cut you off in traffic, your first reaction might be, hey, this person is a jerk, down to their core. This is a bad person. They don't care about other people's needs. They only care about themselves. And that's only a tiny interaction you had with this individual, but yet you're making very large attributions about their behavior, when in fact, maybe they're normally a good driver, but that particular day they were late for work, or maybe, an emergency happened at the hospital and they had to rush across town, and all kinds of factors that are taking place. But unfortunately, in the moment, that's really hard to think about, especially when we're upset or we're experiencing a lot of emotions. But it's very easy to see why we succumb to the fundamental attribution error, because it's a lot easier. It doesn't take a lot of time to sit down and think, and, well, maybe this person is having a bad day, or maybe this person is late, or blah, blah, blah. So we're more likely to explain other people's behavior in terms of their dispositions, whereas we're more likely to explain our own behavior in terms of external factors, situational factors. So this is called the actor-observer effect. We blame other people. We attribute other people's behaviors to dispositional factors and our own behaviors to situational factors. So if somebody else cuts us off in traffic, they're a jerk. But if we cut somebody off in traffic, we were just late for work, and normally we don't drive that bad. Normally we're better drivers. There's also the self-serving bias, where we blame success, or we ascribe success to things that are internal to us, like I'm really smart, I passed my test because I'm really smart, versus failures are blaming on external factors. Like, well, I didn't pass my test because the teacher made the test too hard. Or so it's a bias. It's kind of a way of sort of psychologically protecting ourselves, and we're trying to explain our own behavior perhaps. So truth or fiction, we tend to hold others responsible for their misdeeds, but see ourselves as victims of circumstance when we misbehave. Pause the video. What do you think? We just sort of talked about this, but what do you think? Yeah, welcome back. It is in fact true. It's one of those fundamental attribution errors, or the self-serving bias. We tend to look at ourselves more favorably when we're trying to explain our own behavior versus the behavior of other people. So that's one area of how our thinking is sort of affected by other people. Another way which we're affected by other people is through social influence. The way our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors will tend to change around other people. And it's really fascinating. People will engage in all kinds of behaviors that are very different when they're in a group versus by themselves. Especially, people will engage in even very destructive or antisocial behaviors because they think they're kind of anonymous in the crowd. And people are also more likely maybe to conform to social norms, sometimes for good, sometimes for worse, when they're sort of influenced by other people, when they're kind of caught up in the moment. And there's a really fascinating research study that looks at this directly, how people will obey authority figures. It's called the Milgram study. And Stanley Milgram, he's no longer alive, but he was a Jewish psychologist in the 1960s who was interested in the question of whether or not the Holocaust, is it possible to happen again? Could it happen in somewhere like America, or was this somehow just unique to Nazi Germany? And he wanted to know, instead of putting people in, because following the trial, following World War II, a lot of the Nazis who were tried for war crimes, their common explanation for why they behaved the way they did was they were just following orders. So that led Milgram to believe, okay, well, if people are just following orders, then, maybe the situation could happen somewhere else. So he wanted to put people in situations where they had to obey an authority figure and see if they would actually follow their commands. And he didn't want to put people in hypothetical situations, but rather he wanted to put people in real situations to see how they would react. And so what he did is he devised an experiment that looked like this. This picture here, 14.3, where you are the teacher who comes into the lab. You're in one room and you have a learner in another room that's divided by a wall. You can communicate back and forth between a speaker. You don't actually get to see this person, but you're communicating through the speaker system, and you're teaching them these vocabulary association words. And basically, for every one they get incorrect, you administer a small electric shock. You can see in this picture, they're hooked up to a device that administers a shock. However, as they get each time they get it incorrect, the voltage is supposed to increase. These are the switches here that increase in voltage, and you're supposed to move from left to right as they continue to get answers wrong, or as they get answers wrong, I should say. And while this is going on, you're in the same room with this experimenter who, even at times when the person on the other side of the wall is complaining of pains, of, this is uncomfortable, I don't want to do this anymore. This person, the experimenter their job is to encourage you to keep going on. Like, hey, you signed up to participate, please continue. You have to continue. They're there to be very overbearing and, again, give you orders that you're supposed to follow. And what they found out is the majority of people were willing to comply with the demands of the authority figure and administer the strongest shock possible, even when somebody on the other side was claiming to being harmed by these shocks. Now, the truth of the matter was the person on the other side was actually never being shocked. The learner, they were faking it. These were pre-recorded responses. So nobody actually was being harmed. But the person who was the teacher was led to believe they, in fact, were administering harm when they were not. However, all participants were debriefed at the end, letting them know that, hey, you didn't actually cause harm in this way. And this study has been replicated dozens of times in a number of different conditions, primarily using only men, only women, using only college students, using non-college students. We've seen it updated, in the last 10 years, and the results mostly hold true that people will sort of give in to the authority figure, and they're more willing to comply to those demands. In some cases, you can minimize that. For example, if you were able to see the learner, you're less likely to push the buttons or give in to the commands. If you have an ally in the room, so to speak, that's supposed to help as well. But for the most part, the majority of people are willing to push the button and give in to the commands. Okay, truth or fiction, most people will torture an innocent person if they are ordered to do so. What do you think? Pause the video, come back with you when you have an answer. It's in fact true. Welcome back. It's true. It's the Milgram study. The Milgram study is a powerful study, albeit a very controversial one, that shows kind of the limits that people can be pushed to by an authority figure. Okay, so what are some of the reasons why people obeyed the experimenter? Well, for one, we are socialized. For the most part, we are socialized to follow authority figures. We are socialized to stop when the police pull us over. We are socialized to show our ID at certain places. I mean, there's all kinds of elements of socialization that involves obeying an authority figure in our lives. We don't have social comparison. In this case, many people were in that room alone. And some modifications where people were able to see somebody challenge the authority figure, the experimenter, before they began their experiment, they were more likely to resist. But if you don't have that comparison, it's much harder to resist. How well you perceive the figure as actual legitimate authority is important. I mean, if we actually perceive, oh, this person is wearing a lab coat like this, they're wearing a lab coat, they must, they have a tie on, they must have authority. If it was somebody who was wearing maybe like flip-flops and a hoodie and shorts, maybe we don't think of them quite as legitimate in the same way. The foot in the door phenomenon is if we comply to a small request, we're also more likely to we're more likely to comply with bigger requests in the future. Inaccessibility of values. If we're stressed out, if we're under a lot of stress and tension, it's kind of hard to draw up our values. Whether, most of the time we would think, I would never hurt anybody, I would never torture anybody or administer electric shocks. But, if we can't bring those values to mind, if we're too stressed out or too much pressure, you can see how maybe those values kind of go out the window. And then finally, there was literally a buffer between the victim and the perpetrator, between the person being shocked and the person doing the shocking in most cases. If you modify that condition where you actually can see the victim, in this case, the rates of compliance tend to go down pretty significantly. And so this also gets into a degree of conformity where we sort of adhere to social norms. We change our behavior to kind of follow the crowd or follow the norms. And again, this is for the most part very common. I mean, as a society, we couldn't function if we didn't have a certain degree of conformity. Like, most of us are conforming to the laws of society, and that's what allows society to function. However, there is such a thing as too much conformity, where we are following the crowd to our own detriment. And this was expressed by a study by Solomon Asch, who wanted to know what is the extent that people are willing to conform their judgments even in the face of erroneous information. So Asch brought participants into a laboratory setting, and they're all sitting at a table. However, everybody at the table except for one person is actually a confederate. They're not actually really participants. They're faking like they're participants. The person who comes in last is the real participant. And everybody in this group is shown picture A, which is the standard line. And then you're shown picture B. And Asch wanted to know, okay, which of these lines, 1, 2, or 3, closest resembles picture A. And so, your first reaction should be, well, it's number 2. It's pretty obvious. It's number 2. We can just look at it and see. However, what happens if 5 or 6 people in front of you give the wrong answer and they say it's really number 1 or number 3? Instead, they all kind of agree that it's 1, when in fact you're looking at it and going, oh, it's 2. Well, what Asch found out was when people deliberately give the wrong answer, conformity rates are pretty high following, giving the wrong answer on purpose. I think the rates will show, I think it's like 2/3 of people are willing to give the wrong answer, even in the face of contradictory evidence, as long as other people before them are verbalizing and saying, I think it's 3 instead of 2. People conform to those beliefs. There's this sort of group pressure to conform and see things as the rest of the group sees it. Now, Ash also did this study a number of times with different modifications, and there are ways that you can drop the rate of conformity or increase it. So read about that in your textbook, but it's just fascinating research that shows, that strong sort of desire and impulse to go along with the group is very inherent in human beings. Okay, truth or fiction, seeing is believing. What do you think? Pause the video. What do you think? All right, welcome back. It's in fact fiction. We learned from the Ash experiment that just because you see something doesn't mean you have to believe it. In fact, there might be overwhelming pressure to believe other things in this case. In the case of the Ash study, there might be overwhelming evidence to see things that aren't really there. Okay, what are some factors that influence conformity? Living in a collectivist culture. Collectivist cultures tend to be more conformist by their very nature. Bigger emphasis on the group versus the individual makes sense. If you want to be liked by group members, you're more likely to conform. People with low self-esteem, higher in social shyness are more likely to conform. If you're not too familiar, if it's a new task or a new environment, we're more likely to conform. The size of the group matters. The larger the group, we're more likely to conform. The more social support we feel like we have, the less likely we are to conform. So it's a number of factors. Now we're going to switch gears and look at aggression. Aggression is a very sort of social, it's an aspect of social, for better or worse. Aggression is what allows, some people to thrive in social settings and some people not to thrive in social settings. So this idea of aggression, we don't necessarily mean violence. I mean, aggression obviously is tied to violence, but it can be social aggression, kind of being cunning or cutthroat in a social way, trying to move up the social hierarchy without actually, physically harming anyone. But it's tied to biology. Or hypothalamus and the amygdala are tied to the as far as the brain is concerned, are tied to aggression. Chemistry, in terms of like testosterone, is a really important chemical for aggression. Freud believed that human beings, by their very nature, are very aggressive, and that it's our way that we react to our frustrations. That it actually feels good to let those aggressions out. It's called catharsis. And then a cognitive view, a much more modernized view of aggression, is that all sorts of factors determine aggressive behavior. It's the values we hold. How do we interpret situations? Do we interpret them as threatened? If we interpret them as threats, we're more likely to be aggressive. And the choices we make and how those influence our behavior. From a behaviorist perspective, we learn to be aggressive via reinforcement. If it's worked out for us in the past, we tend to, we learn, oh, this can work out for me in the future. But the truth is, it's probably also related to observations that we make of other people. If we see somebody else being aggressive and getting something they want, acquiring the things that they want, then we go. It's kind of that monkey see, monkey do thing. Oh, I saw my brother. He was aggressive and he, was in his sport, in his basketball game or whatever, and he got all kinds of rebounds and scored all kinds of points. Now, I need to be more aggressive on the court. I need to be more aggressive, in my job or whatever. So a lot of it's learning. There could also be situational factors that influence aggression, like temperature matters a lot. People tend to be more aggressive when it's hot versus when it's cold. The more frustrated we are, if we're sitting in traffic and we're boiling and in the heat, and we're frustrated, we tend to be more aggressive. So there are a number of explanations for where aggression comes from, and another number of factors that determine where aggression comes from. Okay. Our behavior also tends to change when we are in the presence of others, and sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Sometimes we might, perform better when we're in the company of others, and sometimes we might perform worse. We might actually mail it in, so to speak. Sometimes being around other people will increase our arousal and our motivation to perform, and other times it kind of hides it. Because we can be if we can kind of hide in the group, this leads to a diffusion of responsibility and even social loafing where, some people will just kind of mail it in. They won't try as hard because they know, hey, I'm in a group. I don't have to try as hard. That's why, sometimes teachers are really reluctant to give group work in classes because inevitably one person or two people try really hard and, one or two people in a group maybe don't try hard at all. So that can be really frustrating. Okay, a lot of times we have to make decisions in groups. We have to come to a consensus, And group dynamics will oftentimes determine sort of how decisions are reached. In some cases, in some situations, it's majority wins. If you're to try to decide, hey, we're choosing between 2 movies tonight, and there are 5 friends, and we have to choose between 2, the majority wins. If 3 of us decide, hey, we want to go see the new Marvel movie, but 2 of you want to go see, 2 of you vote to go see, the new Fast and the Furious movie, hey, we're going to go with majority wins. The truth wins. This is where, as evidence, we base our decision off of evidence. So as more evidence comes in, as the truth becomes revealed, we make our decision. 2/3 majority is basically how juries work, and in some cases, some of our political systems work this way, where you don't need just a simple majority of 51%, but you need 2/3. You need or a super majority, even larger than that, 3/4 majority in some cases. So there are a number of different sort of schemes or rules and ways in which we use to make decisions. A lot of it depends on time and place. Context is important for a lot of things, including making decisions. But it's also really interesting as we tend to make riskier decisions when we are in a group versus when we're by ourselves. In fact, we see, groups, they take sort of stronger positions or riskier positions when they're unified together versus by themselves. We call this the polarization effect, where again, this idea of anonymity in the crowd, it makes it easier for us to maybe take risks, when all the blame and the weight of the decision isn't placed on the individual, but rather the group. It's kind of easier to make these riskier or more polarizing choices. An interesting phenomena of group decision-making is also groupthink, where the idea is rather than making the right decision, it's more about making the decision that promotes group cohesion. And there are some really interesting political examples, historical political examples, like the Bay of Pigs or the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We see that rather than basing our information or decision in those cases off of like the actual whole truth and information, there was much more of a pressure or motivation to achieve group cohesion. We need to be in this all together. We need to make this decision all together, whether it's right or wrong. This is impacted by external threats, the leader, how dynamic the person is as a leader, how unifying they are, and then also how cohesive the group is. If the group is kind of splintered and you have a dynamic leader who can kind of rally people, maybe you see more instances of groupthink, but the more cohesive the group might be, maybe the decisions are going to be based on information rather than affirmation. Okay, other factors involved in groupthink: feeling invulnerability, the group's rightness. These are sort of like biases. These are biases that make it hard to make the right decision. You just think you're so right. You're so maybe too close to the problem. You're not willing to look at contrary evidence, for example. If you've reached a point where you think you know it all and you're not willing to look at contrary evidence, you should maybe take a step back and realize you're probably engaging in some either groupthink or very biased thinking at best. So, all right. One of the last things we're going to talk about is this idea of deindividuation, how people will behave differently when they are in a mob type setting, for example, a large crowd. This idea that people will change their behaviors completely differently. They'll behave in completely different ways. I find sporting events to be a really good example of this. When people are in large sporting events together, they'll say and do things they would not normally do on their own. Like booing, for example, a large collective group of individuals who boo at a sporting event is quite normal, and it makes a lot of sense. It's a good way to really let sporting teams or athletes or whoever know, the ref or whoever your angst is at, let them know, hey, we don't like this. But imagine if individuals walked around booing other individuals. If I walked around and walked up to somebody and said, boo, boo, that would be really weird and probably inappropriate. People would look at me quite funny. So sometimes we get into a crowd and we think and behave totally different. A lot of it has to do with anonymity. We think, well, I'm sort of anonymous. I can't be seen as an individual versus, when I'm all by myself, it's much easier to be seen. When, we're in a group, we can kind of hide things. We can sort of, literally be anonymous. We can almost be invisible in some cases. There's also a diffusion of responsibility. Hey, everybody else around me, they're booing too, so I'm just getting into it. arousal due to noise and crowding. Again, you kind of get caught up in the hype. There's a bigger focus on group norms rather than the values. We lose sight of our own values sometimes when we get so into, into the group setting, into the group dynamic. So it's, next time you're at a sporting event or a concert, just kind of be aware of your own behavior. In some cases it's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with booing at a sporting event, but you can see how very quickly this devolves and, mob mentality devolves and can even become very destructive. Like, I think of like sporting events in cities where the winners even riot and destroy and loot their own city. And like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you just won. I get it, I guess, if you lost, but if you won, why are you flipping cars? Why are you smashing windows? I think that's maybe more so with hockey teams. I see it more so, but it's a really interesting dynamic in my opinion. One of the last things we're going to talk about is altruism, is doing the right thing. In some cases, just having a selfless concern for other people leads to very, helpful and even heroic behaviors. But in other cases, we see where if we are surrounded by other people, we may avoid altruistic behavior because we think somebody else is more likely to help. Somebody else will help and I don't really have to. And this is called the bystander defect, where it's this assumption that somebody else is watching. Maybe they'll do something to help. I don't need to step in. And we see that this really sad case study of this happened with in New York City in the 70s with Kitty Genovese, a lady who was attacked and murdered outside of her apartment in, I think, the 1970s. She was on her way home. It was kind of late at night and she was attacked, and multiple people in her apartment complex witnessed the crime, witnessed her being attacked, but did nothing to stop it, nor did they call the cops. There are a number of factors that might influence why they didn't do anything to help or stop, but it's still a really sad case study about this idea of the bystander effect, that everybody in this apartment complex just assumed, hey, this other person's going to call the cops, or this other person's going to stop it. I don't have to do anything about it. And one thing led to another, and she was eventually killed. So, this is kind of the opposite of altruism. And in some cases, we engage in altruistic behavior. We sacrifice our own interests for the interests of others. In some cases, we only accept our own interests. So, anyways, it's kind of this balancing act of altruistic versus bystander effect. And there are a number of factors that determine whether we're going to help somebody or not. Our own mood matters a lot. Are we driven towards empathy? If we don't presume an emergency exists, we're not going to help. But if we actually think there is an emergency, we're more likely to help. If we assume the responsibility, we're more likely to help. If we actually know what to do, in some cases, I imagine if you're watching somebody get attacked, brutally attacked, that might be overwhelming to the point where you wouldn't even know what to do. Hey, I'm not strong enough to go out there and stop this person from killing another person. And maybe people panic and freeze. I'm just speculating here. Knowing the victim, having similarity to the victim is an important factor, determining whether we're going to help or not. But all of those are important factors. So, truth or fiction, nearly 40 people stood by and did nothing while a woman was stabbed to death. Pause the video. What do you think? This is in fact true. This is the story of Kitty Genovese. I didn't remember the exact number. Sorry, I didn't mention that in the previous slide, but quite a few people, obviously several dozen people, saw this happening and did absolutely nothing about it, for better or worse. And I hate that that's the last story that we wrap up on for this chapter and also for this course, but here we are. We're finished with chapter 14. We're also finished with the Rathus text. Thank you so much for spending the last 14 chapters with me. I'm sure some of you may have gotten tired of my voice by now, and maybe I'm even a little tired of my voice, so I'm kind of glad we're wrapping things up. My voice is a little tired, but I'm so glad to share this journey of psychology with you, and so I hope you learned a few things, and hopefully maybe it sparked your interest to learn a little more about psychology. So anyways, if you are finished with your journey through Intro Psych, I wish you the best of luck. If you still have some more left to go as far as like tests or anything like that go, best of luck is there as well. So anyways, see you on the other side, folks.